Our final presenter in this session before the break is Ray Palmer. Ray has over 20 years of experience involving applications of forensic biology in both the English and Scottish legal systems. He holds his Bachelor of Science in Biology and his Master of Science, Forensic Science from the University of Strathclyde. He is presently a consulting forensic scientist and lead examiner in the area of textile fibers at the Forensic Science Service in England. Today, Ray is going to share with us his work in the Ipswich serial killings.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Like Genevieve, I think it's probably obvious to you that my accent is not from these shores. So I guess it's an afternoon of strange accents for you. Before I begin, I'd just like to thank the steering committee for inviting me and to share and talk about this case, which took up over a year of my life, and really very interesting case. To me, it's the ultimate fiber case. It has many issues regarding casework management, recovery, interpretation, analysis, and it also demonstrates the high value of intelligence that fibers can give us. And I think it also exemplifies the context sensitivity of forensics evidence, in as much as DNA isn't necessarily the best technique to use. Sorry, I used DNA there, didn't I? I said the D word. The best evidence type to use depends on the question you're trying to answer. And I think that this case exemplifies that quite nicely. So really, let's take you quickly through this. I have a half an hour to talk about something that took me a year. So this case basically relates to a situation in 2006, Christmas 2006, where over a 10-day period just before Christmas, the naked bodies of 5 women were found in various locations on the outskirts of the town of Ipswich, which is in the county of Suffolk in England. All the women had died due to asphyxiation. They were all active prostitutes. And as with many prostitutes, they were all habitual drug users. They used prostitution as a means of funding their habit. Case actually attracted massive media interest during the investigation and the subsequent trial. We had news crews from all over the world. We had them from as far away as Japan and Canada. I don't know if any of you guys here had saw this on the news here, but certainly there were American networks present at the time, and we'll go over that later. Just to show you, for those of you who are not familiar with UK geography, this is the southeast of England, and there you can see the coast of France on the bottom right. And there is the town of Ipswich. It's a little country town, very, very small. In the scheme of things, you can see London in the south there. And of course, Huntingdon, which is the laboratory, the Forensic Science Service facility at Huntingdon, which is one of 6 facilities we have in England and Wales. And like I say, Ipswich is in a very rural area. They don't tend to get an awful lot of major crime, so as you'll find out, this